I mean, I can't match Lisa, but I lived it. And first of all, I want to say I actually came to Palestine in 1938 under a third category, namely as a student. I came under a student certificate. And I know for certain that I mean, I was only a small girl, but not that small that I didn't know what was happening. As a matter of fact, the certificates were individual certificates. And I can't enter into the discussion either about the possibilities of going. I do remember, because after we could no longer go to German schools, my parents decided once you can't have a proper education, inverted commas, then I should go to a Zionist school, Jewish school, and I was entered into Zionist Jewish school. And I remember very clearly that those children who became involved with youth area certainly had priority over those of us whose background was not that much involved in the Zionist movement, the youth movement, and who sort of came a little bit towards the end of the queue. Anyhow, I can really only tell you about what life looked like to me. I arrived in Palestine. We were talking, as I said yesterday, it so happened that the day on which I was due to leave from Trieste, there was a meeting between Hitler and Mussolini in Trieste, so our boat was diverted and we left from Venice. And when we got to Palestine, there was a terrible, terrible storm and something or other happening in Haifa harbor. So the boat docked outside Jaffa and we were taken into little boats and then into Tel Aviv, which I think must have been a very small harbor. I have no recollection about the size of a harbor.
It was tiny because they just moved from the Jaffa port.
Right, because I seem to remember that the boat docked outside Jaffa, but that we actually landed in what was Tel Aviv. From there, immediately, my first journey was to Nahalal, where I had a family, an uncle and an aunt, with cousins. Again, the sort of people who did exactly what you saw on that film, namely, we must forget everything about our past. I mean, we now live a new life, and we have a new approach, and we forget that we ever had a past. The one thing nobody ever forgot was that culture bit. So when you came back from the cow shed, oh my God, there was so much bog there, you have no idea.
Whereabouts was this?
In Nahalal.
Which part of it?
In the Emet Israel. And I mean, it really stuck to you. And
like yesterday.
yeah, a bit like yesterday. I think a little worse than yesterday. And my first recollection then, and I was then a girl of not yet 14, is that they were playing Mozart in my uncle's room, and everybody from Nahalal, of course, drifted in and out. But some neighboring Arabs came in and out, drifted in and out as well. Nahalal as a settlement was very, very friendly with the surrounding Arab villages and the muhtars, the mayors of the heads of the villages. From there, I went to Haifa. My parents were still in Germany. From there, I went to Haifa, and I went to a school called the Biram School, which was a school which was run by a German Zionist. I think he was a very close friend originally of both Achat Ha'am and Magnus. Very strict disciplinarian, and the first thing that shocked me to the core was that during interval we were supposed to do what's called in Hebrew Targil Seder, which is military left, right, and at that tender age that was my first confrontation with officialdom, and I don't think I've ever looked back. So I didn't fancy it, and I had just come out of that sort of atmosphere, and I did not like the idea at all. Later on, my parents arrived eventually, my brother, my sister, we moved to Tel Aviv. When there was no money to educate 3 children, as I had had 8 years of schooling in Germany, I was put into commercial school. At the end of my commercial schooling, and yes, of course, in the intervening period, there was the White Paper of 1939. It was a period of an immense mixture of influences. first of all, at that age, one is not that politically alert, and you really only live very much within your own world. So I have a very funny recollection of a mixture of opposition to white paper and marching. And at the same time, the Hatikva invariably being sung simultaneously with a song which was a poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik set to music, the Techezakna, which talked about the strengthening of the arms of our brethren wherever they are, and who are, and it was, I think a bit ambivalent in the wording, who are the resources of our countries wherever they are. So whether they meant the brethren abroad, the socialists, who were also the resources of Judaism, or whether they actually meant the workers in Palestine, I never knew. But anyway, that song, so there was this mixture of a very strong socialism and an idealism. And statehood, of course, was never discussed. However, when I lived in Tel Aviv, and by that time I was sort of just getting on to 15, or 15, I got very friendly with a young man from Germany who had been a member of the Betar, which was the youth movement the youth movement of the revisionist movement. And I was taken down at one part of Dizengoff Street into a derelict sort of forecourt, and there they were sitting around the fire, singing songs about Stege dort HaYarden, the two sides of the Jordan, they are ours, these as well. And that again frightened me. I mean, again, more as an instinctive reaction, but it was a very, very militant influence which I rejected outright very early on, and that actually had formed me. And then I did funny things when I graduated at 17 from that commercial school, where I wasn't much good actually, because first of all I was bad at typing, secondly I wasn't very intelligent about shorthand, and thirdly I just could not come to grips with Hebrew literature, which was we had to read reams and reams of things from Mendele Mocher Sfarim, and it was a very, very strange and alien world to me. And I found this very odd, but I learned it all by heart, and it's still all there. And when I hear it now, I'm very pleased, because something clicks. I then went to work in an establishment which was part and parcel of the Jewish Agency, which was called the Machon Lemishar Chutz. It was called the Foreign Trade Institute, and our job was to help the export of the Jewish manufacturers in Palestine into the neighboring Arab countries. And for some 2 years, 3 years that I worked there, I was constantly confronted with purchasers either from the British Army or from the much maligned and heavily disliked French army in the Lebanon, because you see the Lebanon had French people in there, and we really didn't think much. I mean, by that time we were fairly we understood about the divisions in the Middle East. And we had purchasers from all over the Arab countries. And these men used to arrive from all these big, big businesses and stores, used to arrive with their families, because their wives and children were taken to the Jewish doctors, particularly the eye surgeons and the gynecologists. And so they also mixed. I guess this was their extras on the trips. Then, just to give an idea, that was in the middle of the war. So at the same time, for instance, I was beginning to learn English at the British Institute in night classes, and Edwin Samuel was giving lectures on Hebrew and English poetry in the Ohel Theater, which was where now the Kikar by the Dizengoff Square. I don't even know what happened to the building. When I go to Tel Aviv nowadays, I cannot recognize some of the parts I used to live in. We lived at that time, when we did live in Tel Aviv, after we moved from Haifa, we lived near what is now the Habima. And I remember the Habima being for years, which is now the Mann Auditorium. And I remember that building for years and years and years being in the process of being built. Right. From there, eventually I got married in 1944 and I moved to Jerusalem. And at that point, my political awareness was aroused. My husband was very much involved was connected with a movement which was called the Yehud movement. The founders of which were Yehuda Magnus, who was the head of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. People like Dr. Ernst Simon, whose son to this day is very much involved in the Peace Now movement. And I got very, very interested in this whole concept of a hope for a living together. Again, I think I moved in circles who were really not terribly eager even to see an established state of Israel. This is sometimes, I thought yesterday, even inside these shuv then, there were people who didn't fancy the idea. And I remember, for instance, I'm going a bit backwards and forwards. I was helping out with the Anglo-American Commission at the time, and I was attached to the anteroom of the secretaries of Richard Crossman. So we were very busy cutting up bits of paper and making carbon copies and running off stencils which never worked. And I remember very, very clearly sitting in, it must have been probably 1946, I guess. Must be. I've got the report of the inquiry here. In the YMCA in Jerusalem, listening to Dr. Magnus talking to the Commission of Inquiry and talking about the ideas of a binational state, of equal rights, of joint administration. And I remember one thing, one of the American members of the commission said, "You speak with such strong moral conviction, and I'm an old man, and I know moral indignation and moral rectitude when I meet it. I can only wish other politicians in the world at this particular time would speak like you do, but alas." And he ended, and it made, I realized then that obviously that sort of effort at liberal equalizing and equalization doesn't have much of a hope. So that's my political background, if you so want, and that's partly, of course, now you know why I react sometimes the way I do react. I remember I was in Jerusalem, in fact I was very close to the King David Hotel in the morning of the explosion of the King David Hotel, and we were at that time, we only lived in a very little garage attached to what is now the beautifully rebuilt windmill opposite the Terra Santa in Rehavia, and we lived by the side, so I didn't have a proper kitchen, so we used to have our main meals in one of those Jerusalem hotels, Andrew, and it was very, very cheap because I wasn't earning very much, and my husband was a lawyer and at that time who also didn't exactly make a fortune. One of the members there was a man called Richard Graves, who later became the last mayor of Jerusalem. And I worked for him for a little while because he had some German antecedents. He came from a family of a German philosopher, Kant. And he needed translation of German documents at the time. I can't really remember why. And so I worked with him at that time. But I remember coming into that dining room after the explosion at the King David Hotel, and we all felt extremely ill at ease, and none of us wanted to look at the other. These are memories which you carry with you to the end of your days.
You mean you knew who had done it and you didn't
Well,
want to feel
we
you didn't
very much
associate it?
guessed who had done it.
Could you take us up just your feelings, 1948, at the time of when independence, got any feelings how it felt to be there then?
Well, I lived in
of the state?
Jerusalem, of course, and after the voting in the United Nations, of course, I think it must have been a day or two later, we already had some shooting of Jews and Jewish families. I lived through the siege of Jerusalem, and I do know the way down from Jerusalem the hard way, because immediately after the siege of Jerusalem, you've all heard about it, no water and no food, and life going on as if nothing had happened, and you go to bed and you never know whether you wake up in the morning. Or we lived in an old Arab house by then. Well, let me tell you this. I lived in a house in Rehavia by the windmill, which after the explosion of the King David Hotel was taken over by the British authorities for the British personnel, and we were diverted to so-called alternative accommodation. And we were housed with some other friends in 2 or 3 rooms in an old Arab house in what was the Baka'a quarter. It's still called Baka'a, that part of the way. It's on the Bethlehem Road, off the Bethlehem Road. And one day we came home and we found a little note on our door. Dr. Weyl, you are in a danger case, and it was signed by the landlord, whereupon we understood that perhaps we'd better pack and go. So we put together a few items and walked back to Rehavia. In those times nobody had cars, and of course we walked everything up and down Jerusalem. We walked back to Rehavia, and by the time we got to the end, roughly where the railway is, to the railway station, we saw the road exploding. The Arabs had put some mines? No, not mines. They had turned over some cars and poured paraffin over them. Paraffin we had plenty, always. They used to come round with little bells, and you used to walk down like the milkman, you used to go out and get a canister of paraffin and take it up to heat, because we had, of course, no stoves, no gas.
Who warned you? Who warned
you? It was the Arab landlord, obviously. Right. I mean, this funny expression, you are in a danger case, always pointed to the fact. But of course, you never have a sense of history when you live in it. So instead of taking that little note off the door and keeping it, preserving it for posterity, I'm sure I threw it away.
This was 1947, 48?
Yes, 1947, 48.
Just before coming up.
Just before the end of the mandate. And, and then there was the end of the mandate. Oh yes, and then I moved to an Arab house, which we actually acquired legally from the then chief clerk of the Supreme Court in Rehavia. And it was exactly opposite a school, the Talita Kumi school. So towards the end of the mandate, and also after that, I lived on a road where our front door and the window was there, and the Talita Kumi school was roughly, I think, not very much further away than where Rita and Bobby are sitting now. And behind there was the Arab Legion, always pointing the guns at us. And we were never quite sure, were we protected by them or was it a bit dicey? But I remember our few possessions eventually, with the help of that Arab landlord, we managed to get on a very small sort of a cart. And I can still see myself calling out to the Arab Legion people over there that a cart is going to come, and that by Talbiya, where you now have the residence of the president, that was an empty plot. We used to pick, what do you call them?
Flowers.
Yeah, flowers. Kalanyot, what do you call comes in me, doesn't it? Anyway, we used to pick flowers there. And at that point, the Arab who had led the horse and the cart up to there left, and we got permission from the Arab Legion that a Jewish friend would help the horse and the cart. And so I removed my furniture under the benign eyes. It wasn't much furniture, but anyway, whatever it was. Then during the siege of Jerusalem, being beautifully exposed and not having quite as many buildings between us and the old city as you now have, we of course set all the guns in. And underneath that house there was a so-called cellar. So it was decided that it would be a wise thing that at night we sleep in that cellar. Well, by the time we I had tried to come to terms with the cockroaches and the mice, like in the Betzalel. We decided that we risk it and sleep rather upstairs, because I think between the two, I probably prefer.
Can I ask you, from your having lived there since 1938 and getting to know quite a number of the Arabs, non-Jewish residents there, what sort of feelings did you have at the time of, as the events drew towards their close, still about the possibility of living in peace with Arabs, and what sort of people they were?
Decidedly hopes. You see, my husband was a lawyer, and we mixed with Arab lawyers, and we used to visit in their houses, and
you got on all right.
We got on all right, but there is one thing I want to say, and I know it's terribly controversial, but having lived in Jerusalem, and having lived through the time of Deir Yassin, and also having heard the songs, I must say, because songs, after all, do influence. I mean, we shudder when we hear the songs of the Nazis marching. Well, some of our Jewish right-wing friends had songs which were equally blood-curdling. And no, it's true, it really is true. And I must say, if I had been an Arab living in Jerusalem, at that time, I would have left. I would not have. It is not true, I think, to say that they only left because they were promised, if we go now, we come back one day and we'll be the conquerors. They also left, and certainly the more civilized Arabs, certainly left because they were simply terrified. And I've also seen during the fighting in Jerusalem, I'm a conscientious objector, so they always put me onto those jobs which are horrible, like cleaning latrines and delousing refugee children, or helping with the rodent control. But at one stage, I was put on a border post between the German colony, again, I think between the German colony and Baka'a, in order to check on the vans and on the cars returning from battle. And we tried to stop the looting. We are no better than any other conquering force. The looting that went on, the dismantling of Arab houses, the dismantling of Arab carpets, and some of these people were many of the Palestinian Arabs were highly educated. And I mean, as I say, if I had been an Arab living there and then, I would also have run.
Thank you. Any other? We've got 10 minutes before lunch is scheduled. Other questions? Thank you very much for those vivid recollections. Other questions to Rita?
During this period, were you aware of what was going on throughout the rest of the world?
Yes. Oh, yes. First of all, we had this marvelous BBC to which everybody tuned in, and you didn't go to bed. I mean, it was our Shema. And to all our listeners, wherever you may be, wait a minute, good night, everybody. Good night. Only the English was nice, better sounding than mine. But, I mean, yes, we knew. We listened. We were definitely. Besides, we lived in a very odd world. When I was working in Foreign Trade Institute, where I worked from 1941 till 1944, my then boss went on an international exhibition, textile and goods exhibition in Izmir, in Turkey. There was a constant coming and going of soldiers. Yes, we knew very much what was going on in the world, and there were rumors, certainly in Jerusalem, about also what was going on in the extermination camps. And I mean, not to the extent of the reality, I think. I mean, I do know of people who knew about it and who reported about it in Geneva. But I think the messages between Geneva and Jerusalem were not that secret, that word didn't get out. So we did know of extermination. But of course we followed it. We all had maps. I mean, we were forever following every bit that happened. Besides, I lived through the bombing of Tel Aviv, the one and only bombing by the Italian planes. It was the Italians, I think, who bombarded Tel Aviv, wasn't it? At the time of El Alamein.
Very early on.
Yes, very early on, because it was just the top of our road by the Habima building where the only two bombs were dropped, actually.
Hmm?
I thought it was earlier than that.
Well, not too important.
And the time of El Alamein was really one of real fright for the issue. I mean, it was days between life or death for us. It really was.
May I ask, how much was the actual British?
I think it was mixed, and I think it was certainly in my younger years. The anti-British feeling was really one that was expressed by the very right-wing people. There was this thing we're talking about the 10,000 under armed. I remember one day my mother cleaning, and I mean that was still in Tel Aviv, and I was still living at home, so it must have been 1942 or something like that. And my mother was cleaning out one of her cupboards, and she suddenly discovered a gun in there, and she nearly fell over backwards. Well, it appeared that my brother, who is 2 years younger than I am, had already, since his very early days in Palestine, been involved in Haganah and Palmach Haganah training and all that, and he kept the weapon at home, and you can imagine my mother had to be sworn to secrecy because she was shrieking. It was all.
Well, I think the labour certificates, you mean?
What?
Well, I mean,
Consider it.
because they hadn't allowed more people in before was there, didn't that hatred of the British government?
People were so busy, Rita. Well, let me say, I was not involved politically in Zionism, and I was a school child and a young girl. So a schoolgirl and a young woman, or young girl. So naturally, I really couldn't answer that. And also, the people I mixed with on the whole, but certainly in Jerusalem, were involved with the administration, were involved with court work. My husband had been involved in something right from the beginning. First thing I heard about him was when the Patria, it was the Patria, Lawrence. No, I remember. When the Patria was scuttled, that he was involved with trying to claim damages from the British government for the refugees. So there was a constant fight, but it took place in a fairly legal way. First of all, compensation for that. Then the constant fight against the British government to make them realize that if you have German spouses, non-Jewish spouses, who left Germany under the Nuremberg laws with their Jewish fiancés or wives or husbands, that they were not aliens and they shouldn't be sent off to the Seychelles. So that was another thing. One was always involved in that. I think there was more a sense of the British just not understanding what was going on.
Well, I think